Hi everybody and welcome to another episode of Historia Politica Pública. This will be the third and the last episode about the series of The Wretch of the Earth, the book written by Frantz Fanon and published in 1961, just months before he died of leukemia. In this episode, I would like to conclude with some of the aspects that I touched in the previous episode, such as his idea of a Manichaean world, the mainstream media, the foundation of the political order through violence, and the necessity to unite the whole colonial world in order to and with the structures created by the settlers. It is interesting how in his book he uses the words native to define the colonized and settlers to refer to the colonizers. So, where does it arise the idea of Frantz Fanon about the foundational violence? This is part of this Western idea of the state as one based on power within a territorial unit. For instance, in the firm assertion of Trotsky at Brest-Litovsk that, quote, every state is founded on force, end quote, this was agreed by Max Weber, the sociologist of the 1910s who examined the Red Army leader definition in detail. In fact, during a speech at Munich University in 1918, just 1 year after Leon Trotsky has expressed his phrase about the foundational state of violence by every state, Max Weber transcribed an essay which was called Politics as a Vocation. In that conference, Weber employed a superlative definition of the state which certainly foresaw the belligerence of the next decades. The German sociologist wrote that the state is formed by a human community which successfully claims, quote, the monopoly of the legitimate use of physical force within a given territory, end quote, in a similar vein as Trotsky did the year before. As the rise of dictatorship in Europe would imminently attest, the right to use violence was a premise followed with all its means by different leaders in a variety of states in Europe. It is precisely within that context of foundational violence that Frantz Fanon emerged as a political writer. Having fought against the Nazi army in France, he witnessed a decade later in Algeria how the ideals of freedom and equality promulgated by the liberal democracies were far from being implemented in their colonies. In fact, on the 8th of May of 1945, the day of the surrender of Nazi Germany, the French army murdered thousands of Algerians in Sétif. The statistics are unclear because the most conservative speak about 15,000 dead and the most the statistics provided by the Algerian side say 45,000 dead. Anyway, there is something between 15,000 and 45,000 dead. Henceforth, it was precisely in those territories where the natives were being killed by the brute force of the colonizers. In Indochina, in Algeria, later on in Vietnam after the independence of Indochina, in India, and so on. In a world divided into compartments, as Fanon despite the colonial situation in The Wretch of the Earth, the policemen and soldiers attacked the natives, quote, by means of rifle butts and napalm, end quote. Therefore, using all the violence that they could take into their account. It was in this book, The Wretch of the Earth, finished, as I mentioned earlier, shortly before he died in 1961, where Fanon portrayed the grim life of the natives in the colonies and composed his ideas regarding the movement in the Third World. His work shows an outstanding description of the life in the colonies and formulates a political theory to create a new kind of society. It must be underscored that Fanon not only advocated for the independence of all the worldwide colonies, but also, and here is where he became an indisputable intellectual figure, he claimed the necessity to elaborate a new theory of humanism removed from the European ideals. He was one of the pioneers of the political ideology of Third Worldism, which was a challenge to the approach of the dichotomy between the First World and the Second World. First world being the Western world dominated by the United Kingdom, France and the United States, and the second world was basically the Soviet sphere. In that sense, Third worldism should emerge as the creation of a new human which could take some ideals of Europe. As Frantz Fanon said, there was not a debate to going back to nature. He is clear about that. But on the contrary, the idea is to take the positive sides of Europe and other countries, but establish a new society with an egalitarian system. In fact, that necessity to elaborate a new theory of humanism, it was fundamental. And this assessment will say how Fanon wanted to establish a non-violent state through the use of violence within the colonial context during the Cold War, and to conclude if Fanon's aim of liberation has been achieved. In spite of his rejection of the European ideals, as I mentioned, Fanon wrote that, quote, there is no question of a return to nature, but, quote, it is implied a very concrete question of not dragging men toward mutilation, end quote. He implied that this new humanist ideology is not difficult to implement as long as the people did not receive influence from European imperialism. And when he used the word mutilation in the book after he mentioned the throwing of atomic bomb in Hiroshima and Nagasaki by the United States. Hans Fanon embraced a new kind of progress based on third world particular characteristics. And the political theories to pursue this idea will be named, as I mentioned, third worldism and post-colonialism, in order to reject the dichotomy of the social, political and economical battle between the United States and the Soviet Union. Although Fanon seemed to direct his vindication mainly against the people in Europe, when he criticized both their hypocrisy and violence to expose that, quote, they are never done talking of man, yet murder men everywhere they find them, end quote, the growth of the earth is inevitably related within the context of the Cold War. He stressed how the capitalist and communist blocs provided the African countries with money and forced them to expend those economic resources in military research. This is something very analogy of what we are seeing today when the United States are forcing the European countries to increase their GDP money to military means. And of course, the different governments in Europe are spending more resources to arm their population, they increase their military power instead of spending those resources in education, in public health, in roads, etc. Thus, the colonies were not only being affected by the settlers, but also by the relentless process of economic flow which operate in the African region as a battlefield of the Cold War. Within this framework, Fanon concluded that in order to free themselves from the colonizers' oppression, they had to make use of violence. This struggle for emancipation might be symbolic, as long as it is carried forward by the business of each and all, and the leader has no special merit within this affair. A grassroots-based and pacific movement of liberation was included within Fanon's theory, and probably he would have exposed the Carnation Revolution of 1974 in Portugal as a clear example of this idea. The revolution which overthrew the dictatorship and it was characterized by the union between the masses of people with the militaries, and is this one of the bloodless revolution in history. They changed the government, but this was because the conditions was convenient for them. The relation of forces was favoring the population of Portugal because the army was tired of fighting in the colonies and dying in Angola, Mozambique, Guinea or Chad, and they decided to overthrow a dictatorship was decaying at that time. However, having witnessed the situation in Algeria, Fanon concluded that due to the repressive violence perpetrated by the French settlers and the impossibility of reaching a peaceful consensus with them to obtain the independence, the only means to unite the natives to free themselves was through the use of violence, as it is perfectly explained in The Grave of the Earth. Eric Hobsbawm grasped perfectly the meaning of the book, and in The Age of Extremes wrote that Fanon's work became tremendously popular during the 1960s among intellectual activists due to its, quote, praise of violence as a form of spiritual liberation for the oppressed. Certainly, Fanon's concept of violence in The Grave of the Earth was defined as all-inclusive and national. It will serve to raise consciousness and emancipate the natives, not only the physical fight against the colonizers, but also to form a new mood of thought. Nonetheless, Fanon observed that the elites in the colonies would diminish the potential to create a new system led by the people. Those upper classes were violent in their words, as he said, to proclaim the independence and ensure people's support, but also reformist in their attitudes, as he concluded. In other words, they wanted to expel the settlers from the power in order to reach themselves the high position, and far from creating a new society from below, they pursue a replication of the European blueprint in the new society. This is something that the daughter of Fanon, Mireille Fanon, analyzes more deeply in the after 2000, how the European Bank is controlling Africa, putting their own bureaucrats in the continent. Also, the market exchange is pressuring Africa in different aspects of the market, the economic transactions, and so on. So, as Fanon puts it, the colonization in the future won't be as bloody as now. He's writing this in 1961, but it will be equally deadly. And he uses the example of Fidel Castro and how his regime will be overthrown by a more benevolent approach. Consequently, if the colonies were following the European ideals of an established hierarchy in which capitalism had become the hegemonical force, a system of enrichment which had its roots in human slavery, ruthless commerce, and exploitation, Fanon's aspiration was inevitably doomed. Quote, "We today can do everything so long as we do not imitate Europe," end quote, is one of many compelling arguments reflected in The Wretch of the Earth, which display a wish to start a new society without the foundational use of violence. And yes, as I mentioned earlier, Mireille Fanon Mendes expressed in 2017 during an interview with Open Democracy how colonialism has simply changed its shape. According to her, globalization functions, quote, exactly like the colonized system, as it segregates people, produces high level of social, political, and economic anxiety, risks inequality, and does not let people to choose an alternative model. So, can we say that the idea of Fanon to support a transformation in order to get a pure emancipation from the colonial system and also establish a new form to govern and to act in society? Has this been accomplished in any society, or rather can we still see some reminiscence of colonialism in different countries in the world, like in India, Algeria, Morocco, Vietnam, and so on? For all of this, Frantz Fanon was not simply an anti-democratic nationalist, but rather he was a person who wanted to change the Western systematic exploitation. For that reason, during his time in Algeria, he joined the Algerian National Front. After he was expelled and from Tunis, he was writing different texts such as The Undying Colonialism, which was published in 1959 in the 5th year of the conflict, and was hugely involved in supporting the FLN also as a psychoanalyst. He helped the people who had some mental problems and act as a doctor to take care of those wounded in combat and so on. So Frantz Fanon, in fact, had great influence during his years, and later on his writing are focused mainly in Africa because he was traveling across the region. I think he went to Ghana after the independence, which was, if I am not wrong, 1958, and other areas there. The social movement of those years in the Cold War took a great inspiration on his writing. Also, he was quite aware of what had happened in Indochina and so on in the Cuban Revolution, which he wrote about that in The Wretch of the Earth. He mentions the Haitian Revolution as the perfect example of black people ruling by themselves, in which obviously the elite did not want to include them under the concept of Latin America. For that reason, the fact that it was the mass of people who led the uprising and did not get any compromise with the elite of the area. So, to finish, the idea of violence as a means of liberation gives the oppressed people, according to Fanon, a sense of agency, and it seems utopic to deal with the colonizer through dialectic arguments, as I mentioned earlier. In that sense, with a movement which will be all-inclusive, which will release the energy of everybody to pursue the interests of the majority of the population, The idea would be to create a democracy in which the popular will be the basis to the new foundation of society, driving programs of social and economic change that will cross national borders. In fact, he rejected the replacing of colonial administration by national middle class who will at the same time exploit the people, and he writes in his book how in Senegal the new president after the independence Senghor was Africanizing the Europeans, as he were told. In other words, giving the most important jobs in the country to those people who had European influences. One important theme of Fanon is racism, which he explores widely in his book Black Skin, White Masks, and he mentions how, quote, everyday life encouraged the development of static frames of mind, end quote. So are these kind of micro activities that are happening in our daily life in which we don't realize how they have been there, but still they are ideologically more powerful sometimes than when you see in an explicit way how somebody is trying to convince you about any argument. In that sense, racism for Fanon is not just the white people are the masters and impose themselves as the masters of the black people. It is also the black people, after centuries of subjugation and propaganda, see themselves as the oppressed people. This is the theory of Lacan between the mirror or the dialectic of Hegel between the master and a slave, in which one needs the other to feel itself identified. And in that sense, race as a category based on color is a product of lived experience. And in the case of the colony, you are black because you are poor, you are poor because you are black, you are rich because you are white, and you are white because you are rich, as Fanon put in the book of The Grave of the Earth. In that sense, he advocates for a construction of racial identities that contest the racist worldview of the colonizers. Henceforth, he ends saying that blackness and whiteness are not national categories of human identity. Are not natural categories of human identity, but are constructed in the interplay of social relation of coercion and domination. And this is something very interesting that also mentions Quos Appia in his book The Lies That Bind, how the different categories like nation, culture, race, and so on are basically in the public imagination through decades and centuries of being indoctrinated by those people in power in order to subjugate the majority. In that sense, just to finish here, in his book Black Skin, White Mask, he provides some examples about that. For instance, he mentioned how difficult it is to break this chain of relation between the master and the slave because both parts need to eliminate this relation. And in that sense, he gives the example of how when he was being raised in Martinique, in all the stories on the programs and so on, the white people were seen as the pure, as the hero, where the natives, the blacks, were seen as the evil, and in the best of the cases as indifferent people without any role in the main adventure that was being written. So this is the end of the series about Frantz Fanon, about the Grave of the Earth, a fascinating book to understand historically the context of the Algerian War of Independence from 1954 to 1962, also to delve into one of the political theories more important in the decolonization process, to comprehend better how his ideas had influence in those years. Also, what did he mean when he mentioned this idea of national unity through violence, symbolic or an explicit violence, a kind of Manichaean war in the colonies between the settlers and the native, how the settlers put points that the native are a sort of quintessence of evil to justify the colonization, and how the native represent the absence and negation of values under their eyes, and how the work of propaganda for many years had to do with that. In fact, in Algeria, Guy Mollet, the new socialist president in 1956, he start to portray the Algerians as evils and monsters as after he went to Algeria and he was received with hostility by the population there. And in that sense, this is a process in which the native is dehumanized, and the settler after that shows all his force to destroy them in order that because knowing that the enemy, the native, are not human, they feel themselves to have their the possibility to use the force without any consequences. However, this theory of the absolute evil, it will have a boomerang effect against them, because after the Battle of Algiers, when the French army go relentless to use their force in Algeria, the global population will tend to support more the National Liberation Front in Algeria. So decolonization, some of the last keys, decolonization as the fundamental to unite people, a dichotomy between good and evil, pure and dark, this idea of break the individualist approach of the Western capitalism to create a community which will be a kind of communist Marxist idea with the third world structures and proper conditions. Also, how the land and freedom are two of the keys that Fanon demands for the whole population. And it's interesting because Land and Freedom precisely is the title of the movie of Ken Loach about the civil war in Spain, focuses mainly in the anarchists in Catalonia and Aragon, and how the anarchist movement led by the CNT and the Marxist Organization Union Party was following those ideals of mutual aid, collaboration and common solidarity. So, the infighting and the alliance with other movements will be fundamental, because Fanon denounced how the Western media is supporting all the time the French side, but something that he doesn't mention in The Grudge of the Earth is that the Algerians also had their own media which will support them. Radio Cairo in Egypt was fundamental to express the voices of the rebels. So Fanon at the time already grasped the importance of the information to trying to win the narrative against the outer world in order to obtain legitimacy from the international sphere, and in that sense this will have consequences for the rest of the conflict. That happened quite especially after the Battle of Algiers, as I mentioned, how in the UN sphere there were representatives of the African and Asian world who demand an end of the hostilities, support the independence of Algiers, and all of this was thanks to the work of the media raising the voices and expanding their message. So there was a clash between the Western media and also the media which was supporting the decolonization process. Another of the quotes of Fanon is this one, quote, "The atmosphere of violence, after having colored all the colonial phase, continues to dominate national life. For the third world is not cut off from the rest," end quote. What does it mean? Fanon was quite aware that even though the independence was attained in Algeria, there could be some hostilities from the other world, and they will have to be ready to stop that. It was a context of the Cold War. There was a possibility of the Western intervention, especially after the Soviet support towards the Algerians, and also the Egyptian provision of armies led by Gamal Abdel Nasser, who had defeated politically the English and the French during the Suez Canal in 1956, when he nationalized that part of the country, which before it was property of the English. Henceforth, also he uses the example of Cuba, how the United States was not happy after Cuba over the revolutionaries overthrew Batista dictatorship imposed by the United States, and so on. So the independence of Algeria must be taken into account among a general context, not just focusing on a national basis, but also knowing what could happen after that. And there is an interesting book which is called Algiers, Third World Capital, in which Alain Moktefi speaks about her experience going to the capital of Algeria after 1962, the year of the independence, and how there were different movements There are organizations such as the Black Panther Party, which was founded, the African one, in Algeria. Also, there were leaders from Yugoslavia, Cuba, the Soviet Union, Egypt, and many countries which tended to be allied with the Soviet sphere, in that Algeria making some contacts and so on. To finish about the idea if it would be possible to mobilize people through non-violent means, I will say yes. In fact, I have done other episodes about the idea of non-violence and civil disobedience. I think it is clearly possible, as we are seeing nowadays, with the movements like feminism, ecological activism, and also for the rights of the LGBTQ plus community, supporting refugees, and so on. Those movements tend to be non-violent, and this has to depend on the context. So if we are living in a liberal democracy, which we had more freedom to speak, this is important to carry on approaches which won't alienate the population. Although the media will always try to do that by any means, even though if there are some ecological activists that throw some tomatoes in a portrait in the National Gallery of London, the thing is like, okay, what is more important, to stop the effects of climate change or the art? And the answer is clear, but still it is important that the people who participate in civil disobedience movement, we will face difficulties, but still it is important to carry on non-violence means. However, when you live under a dictatorship, it's a different mean, because the military and the army, which is under the power of the state, remember what I mentioned at the beginning, the foundational force of the state and how the state have the legitimacy use of violence, will kill people in their thousands. That doesn't matter. There are many examples in history about that, in the Spanish dictatorship, in Russia under Tsarism, how the 1905 revolution failed because the military were supporting the Tsar, and how in 1917 it was precisely the military who sided with the Bolsheviks, and precisely the Tsar was overthrown in February for that reason, because people did not want to live under a regime which had sent their people to die. And the February Revolution and the October Revolution led by the Bolsheviks was a kind of paradigm in that year of the end of the First World War. And many more examples in history are like that, such as the French fight against the Nazis, the resistance in Italy against fascism, the partisans in Yugoslavia, and so on. So it depends on the relation of forces and the kind of system in which we are living. But Fanon also said how violence helped to spark a response of the French state, which act as a counterproducent mechanism to them. It modified the attitude of the colonies, and the French panic and sent its generals to Algeria in 1956, as mentioned, and the OAS, the far-right paramilitary elements, in 1961 they were created in Madrid, and they were sent to defeat the Algerians. And here I will finish the episode, just to encourage you to read The Rage of the Earth. The book is amazing. At least the first chapter, I think, is the more important, is titled Concerning Non-Violence. There are 60 pages, it's fine. The preface of Jean-Paul Sartre, very interesting to understand the context of those years. Also, the other books like Allying Colonialism and Black Skins, White Masks are fabulous to understand the psychoanalytic approach of Frantz Fanon and his comments during the Algerian War of Independence. Thanks so much for listening to the series. I hope you enjoyed with Frantz Fanon and the other theories that he had. Please share the other articles, comments, books about other political theories that specialize in the decolonization process, because it will be fundamental to understand what was happening in those years and how we can comprehend better the movement that are happening today, the legacies of those years.